In this final video of Chapter 2, we're going to take a closer look at the areas in which the 5-year plans have clearly failed. In order to have a clear understanding of the effectiveness of any plan, we must look at both its successes as well as its failures. In fact, there is often more to be learned from one's failures, as it provides us a perspective of what needs to be done in order to improve in the future. In fact, Bill Gates is famously quoted as saying, "Your most unhappy customers are your greatest source of learning." With that said, let's take a look at each of the failure areas. The first is abject poverty. The second is high rate of inflation, followed by unemployment crises, deficient infrastructure, and skewed distribution. The first of these, abject poverty, refers to the persistence of poverty in India. The two measures which the textbook uses to justify the failure of the plans are the level of caloric intake of India's average citizen, as well as the absolute percentage of people living under poverty. Although these two measures are far from exhaustive, they do provide us with some valuable insight. First of all, the average Indian is not consuming the recommended number of daily calories. Whether this threshold is correct or not is a matter of debate, as the average caloric intake in Japan was only 1,874 calories last year, which is far less than India. Secondly, although the fact that 22% of people live under the poverty line is troubling, the reality of the situation is probably far more grim than this data suggests. So, although continuing levels of poverty are a huge area of concern, this book doesn't do a great job of providing any sort of statistical details to prove this. Next, let's take a look at the rate of high inflation. Although the data fluctuates significantly, the real problem with inflation was only briefly mentioned in the textbook. As inflation rises, the actual value of cash in hand diminishes. To demonstrate this, I'm going to provide you with a simple example. Imagine that you are working on a farm and being paid in cash. In addition, you are saving this cash at home because it is difficult for you to get to a bank in the countryside. In a situation where you have 1,000 rupees saved, if the inflation rate is 10%, that means after 1 year, the amount of food that you could purchase with that 1,000 rupees is less than it was a year ago, since the price of good has risen by 10%. Since the prices of goods have risen by 10%. More simply, if milk was priced at 100 rupees last year, this year it is 110 rupees, meaning that your 1,000 rupees was previously able to purchase 10 cartons of milk, but this year you are now only able to purchase 9 cartons of milk, hence making you worse off. So, when inflation rises, those who are heavily dependent on cash become worse off, especially the poor. Moving on to the unemployment crises, before we look at the graph in detail, there's a single piece of critical data that you need to think about. In India, there are 40 million people who are actively looking for work but unable to find gainful employment. To put that in perspective, 40 million is larger than the entire population of Nepal. I hope that gives you some sort of impression about the scale of this problem. Secondly, let's take a look at the graph. The graph provides some additional, very troublesome information. Simply explained, the number of new job opportunities which are being created are being outstripped by the increase in the labor supply, which is a direct result of the increase in population. Although this difference of 0.2 seems fairly insignificant, when we are talking about a population of over 1 billion people, the difference is enormous. One of the primary areas that the planning should be trying to address is the development of infrastructure, but India's infrastructure is still nowhere near where it needs to be in order for India to maximize its efficiency. Below are just some areas where infrastructural development is still required. Of note, medical facilities, educational facilities, and access to stable electricity are still not up to an acceptable level in most areas of the country. Finally, the topic entitled Skewed Distribution is explaining that as time passes, the gap between the rich and poor is expanding, both in terms of rupees and number of individuals. To think about this another way, the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. Obviously, this is not one of the goals of the plan and is something the future plans need to address, because if they don't, social unrest will definitely increase, and this might lead to some very undesirable consequences for India.